Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I kind of want to talk about the topic of spin-offs, you know, whether it becomes movies or TV shows or whatever the case may be. Just the general topic of them, because I find it fascinating when spin-offs are a thing. Like, because spin-offs usually only happen because something is, it's like, oh, the popularity of this thing eventually leads to something else being created from it. Like, obviously, like, one big spin-off that's kind of in the talks right now is a Venom movie, because of like, I mean, which is interesting that that's coming up, even though like Spider-Man Homecoming has yet to come out, especially at the time of me recording this. It's still like a couple weeks away at this point in time, but still, I mean, I guess it's just projections and stuff like that. Because typically I always feel like, I mean, and this is just based on my limited knowledge of the stuff I've watched, but I feel like spin-offs are, I mean, sadly are never as successful as the original material, which is also interesting to me. Like, someone can watch one material and not the other. Because some prominent examples are like, the DC shows on the CW, they're technically spin-offs of each other. I mean, I think Arrow in itself is kind of a spin-off of Smallville, but I don't really think that, I mean, it came about because of the huge success of Smallville that led to Arrow being a thing. I mean, actually, I think they originally wanted Justin Hartley to kind of reprise his role. I mean, I think they changed things up and stuff like that. Maybe, I think some early talks about, you know, Arrow were going to be about that, but like Justin Hartley, if you don't know, is he played Oliver Queen / Green Arrow in Smallville. But I think like one thing was he didn't want to be a part of that project because he was like, I mean, like I said, I think this is like in the early talks before maybe they didn't make any decisions to make Arrow what it is, you know, like he felt like it would be him kind of running away with the success that, you know, came from Smallville, because it was already an established thing, and it's like, oh, you know, he'd be kind of pulling from that fan base already. So I guess that's his mentality about it. But then again, it's like, I think Arrow didn't really do that anyway, because it's very different from Smallville in the sense of like, because obviously they're very different Green Arrows. The one from Arrow versus the one from Smallville are very different arrows. So I guess that falls under that category, but I mean, more so like than anything, everything within the Arrowverse. Initially, it makes me wonder, like, does Supergirl count as one? I mean, it seems like that might have just been its own thing, but now that's slipped into the Arrowverse too. So does that make it so that it is now technically a spin-off? Because definitely Flash and Legends of Tomorrow are definitely spin-offs, but you know, it's just kind of an interesting thing. Because to me, what's always been interesting in my head is like, what's the difference between a sequel and a spin-off? I mean, obviously there's like, because like, to me, like a sequel is like, oh, you are continuing this narrative that's already been set beforehand. And a spin-off, it's like, yeah, it takes place within that narrative, but it doesn't follow that main narrative. It's a thing that kind of follows its own story off somewhere else. Kind of going back to using the example of like, oh yeah, Arrow is its own story here in Star City, and then like the Flash, it's like, oh, this is everything in Central City. Obviously there's crossover and everything, but it's like the stories are contained in their own quote unquote worlds, I guess, you know? But then like, what's some, like, take something like Better Call Saul. Better Call Saul is a prequel, but I think that still falls under the category of being a spin-off. Does a spin-off have to take place at the same time for it to be a spin-off? You know, while everything is happening, you know, along the lines of like Arrow and Flash, like they're simultaneously happening at the same time. Is that what makes them spin-offs, you know? But then, you know, I mean, if you really get technical about it, Legends of Tomorrow is all about time travel and everything. So technically it doesn't take place at the same time as Arrow and Flash. But then again, it's like, you know, that's, never mind. That's diving too deeply into that. But I guess because that's where my mentality has always been about spin-offs. It's like, oh, maybe this happens, I don't know, like I said, in the established universe, this is something that's happening somewhere else. It's a story taking place somewhere else. Because spin-offs can introduce characters from this main story plot element and bring it over here. Like a great example is like the Vampire Diaries and the originals. Obviously, they take place in the same universe, but they're very separate stories, which they do have crossover moments, but still, it's an example of something that is happening. It's another example of something happening simultaneously. So that's where my mindset is. But once again, you have something like Better Call Saul. Does that even fall under the category of a spin-off, or is it just purely a prequel? But it has all the makings of a spin-off. Like I said, I'm sure I'm overthinking this too much, but it's just something I've never really thought about too much and ever really looked into. A point I brought up, it's a little sad that like the popularity of one thing won't translate over into another. I don't believe this, but it's certain things I've read about like the originals. I don't think it's as popular as the Vampire Diaries was, which is like kind of sad to me. But it's like, if you like this one show, you should, I guess in my mind, for whatever reason, I'm thinking, oh, you should automatically like the spin-off, which isn't only the case. Because I mean, maybe you like a specific show because like, oh, it tells, I don't agree with this, because I like the Vampire Diaries and the original as equal, because they're equal in my head. Because I mean, they're very different shows set in different locations and different characters dealing with their different issues. I'm sure there's probably different people behind the projects too, so different perceptions and different perspectives. It's kind of what I meant to say. Nevertheless, I'm also curious, like, are there any situations where people like a spin-off more, like spin-offs more than the original? Has there ever been a situation where like someone only watches something like, oh, I like the spin-off, and because I'm already hearing the spin-off, I'm not interested in watching the original? But along those lines too, like take something like a video game series, for example, is like Kingdom Hearts. Like technically every subsequent game of Kingdom Hearts is technically a sequel. Obviously you have something like Birth by Sleep, which represents a prequel and everything like that. But still, would anything within those game series be considered spin-offs? I mean, they're all subsequently considered sequels. But then again, I was like, I've always had the mentality that a sequel has to have a number. It's kind of like the same, but then it's kind of like the Suikoden games, like, or Suikoden, however you want to say the game titles. Like obviously there's the main numbered games, but then there's also all these other subsequent spin-offs from that too, which kind of falls in the category of like, oh, there's this main overall plot. Which even those type of games, they kind of fall into the category of like Final Fantasy, where it's like, oh, they're their own stories. I mean, granted, they're typically all kind of set in the same universe. Granted, they just take place at different points in time and in different countries and locations and stuff like that. So I guess it still falls under the category of that grand overall storyline, but then the spin-offs that take place within those said storylines and just side stories and stuff like that, it's a complicated thing. Like I guess like this whole video is convoluted. That's all I gotta say. Like I just kind of very convoluted, something that's simple, and I kind of turn it into something that's not so simple, and I hate myself for it. My question to you guys is, what are your thoughts about spin-offs and stuff like that? Do you like them? Do you hate them? Like what did you know, like really your thoughts on like, has there ever been a situation where you do like the spin-off more than you do the original material? Or is there situations where you've watched the original material but you've never watched like any subsequent spin-offs of it, stuff like that? Let me know in the comments down below about just all the random crap that's come out my mouth in this video. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Until the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.